Again. Greetings and salutations, and welcome to Vesperisms, the art of thinking for yourself. I'm your host, author-illustrator Vesper Stamper, and this is your sometimes weekly, sometimes 15-minute recalibration of your artistic worldview. So grab your coffee and have a seat here in my studio, and let's have a chat. This is episode 9, Iconoclasm. It's been interesting to me to see how our culture's moment of unrest and destruction seems to ultimately hinge on works of art. Whether it's public monuments or banned books and shamed authors, or actors barred from certain identity-based roles. Whatever your opinion about the appropriateness of that, you can't deny that so much of this is centered on art and artists. In regard to public works of art and their attendant historical significance, as an author-illustrator of historical fiction, both art and history are two fields that obviously mean a lot to me personally. A lot goes into the decision to erect monuments, either with public money or private fundraising. We know, for example, that many of the statues commemorating figures in the Southern Confederacy were paid for by the United Daughters of the Confederacy decades after their loss of the Civil War as a very intentional way to change the public narrative. Whatever the public chooses to erect or tear down in the form of public monuments says a lot about its values, and when those works are dismantled and by whom also speaks loudly of public values. In our last episode, I spoke about the difference between a final artwork and a draft. You know, countries can have drafts too. One of the earliest drafts, you could say, of the United States Constitution was the English document called Magna Carta. King John of England was wielding his divine rights all over the place in 1215, and the barons had to check and balance his sorry self. And through the centuries, documents defining the rights of the populace in relation to the authority of the state has gone through many iterations. And we are in one of those moments right now. Whatever you're leaning politically, and as you know, Vesperisms is a show about art, not politics, I want us to observe that we are in a moment of what is called iconoclasm. There have been many cycles of iconoclasm, or the destruction of a culture's images, throughout history. Early on in Christianity, the debate raged over whether sacred images broke the second commandment, an injunction against the worship of man-made images. There were several major iconoclastic purges in the Byzantine and Catholic churches, and then again when Protestantism broke away from the Catholic Church. It's the reason why artists who are Protestant Christians today have such a warped understanding of their role in their own faith, because hardly any of them saw modeled a healthy use of sacred images. And I would say that as a country founded mainly by Protestants, we still carry forward that bewilderment when it comes to art on a national scale. So when I decided to do this episode, I asked my friend Jonathan Pageau to come and chat with me, because who better to talk about iconoclasm than a creator of icons? Jonathan is an Eastern Orthodox icon carver, and he also has a fascinating podcast called the Symbolic World, where he shows how ancient archetypal and metaphysical patterns reveal themselves in culture through analysis of movies. I think you'll find this enlightening. Here's my interview with artist and philosopher Jonathan Pageau. You're a really interesting conversation partner, because there's some like very beloved things that we have in common, you know, but there's also some ways that we diverge artistically. But first I want to just kind of establish some terms. And so when we talk about iconoclasm, let's step back a minute and establish that you are an icon carver. And for those who don't know what that is, would you describe what you do?
Yeah, so I am an Eastern Orthodox Christian. That church has developed a sacred language. I mean, Christianity itself developed a sacred language until the late Middle Ages. There was a kind of a unified language of Christian art, a sacred language. So what I do is I connect myself to that language, and I create images which are used by the community of Christians in church, in their houses, to remember the saints, to participate in their liturgical life and their life of worship. And I'm engaging, participating, and making modifications on it. And I'm creating actual objects, images, but also objects, let's say crosses for processions or for blessing or all kinds of stuff.
What an icon is, right? I mean, it's first of all not an image that is worshipped, right? But it is an image that is like a window into something. And would you talk about like what your conception of an icon is, not just the function of it, but what what it is. What is its essence?
Right. So when we use the word icon just means image, but usually when we say the word icon, it's kind of a shorthand for sacred image. So the idea that there are certain types of images which are special, but they're not completely isolated in the way they work. So the notion is that image is a form of presentation. And so it makes something present to you in its absence. That's what image does. You look at a picture of your mother and you can engage your mother. You see your mother because it's just a piece of paper, right? But there is a human capacity we have to recognize people in their image. And so that is something that Christians struggled with for a while because of the Old Testament prohibitions against making images. They struggled with it for a while. And the big question ended up being, does the image of Christ, the fact that you could recognize him, and you could say, if someone asks you, where's the Messiah? Or even, where's God incarnate? And someone could have pointed to him and say, there, that's God. Like, that's a crazy thing, first of all. But that his image participates in that, right? Part of body means image. And so it's a recognition of that. And not just a recognition, but also if you deny the image, if you deny the fact that you could see Christ, you're denying an aspect of the incarnation. And so in a way, for let's say for Orthodox Christian, the making of images in the church ends up being the resolution of the second commandment. The reason why the second commandment was given was that God was going to give us an image of himself, right? And that image of himself was going to restore the image of God in us, that we would be restored as being images of God. And so the idea is that we have images of holy people, of course, of Christ, of his mother, of the saints, and we recognize that those images are in a certain manner, a presencing of those people. That is, they make us, just like when you look at a picture of your mother, you feel like you can connect to your mother, the same way that these images connect us to the people that they're represented. There's nothing magical about it. A lot of people want it to be magical. It's not magical. It's just, that's what images do. They present something in its absence. And so that's what we have. So there's this celebration. So as let's say in the church, we have images of the saints, and we have, of course, images of Christ. And those images, they create this symphony of participation. Whereas we look at the saints, we see them with us in prayer towards God. And there's this kind of this communion of the saints that happens by having images of them with us as we're celebrating.
Right. So almost the way that a photograph would function to trigger that part of your brain that evokes the same kind of reaction that you might have if your mother was in the room.
Just like I said, like if you kiss an image of your mother, obviously you don't think that image of your mother is your mother, right? You know that it's not, but there is this sense that you feel the need to recognize the image as being a way that you are connected to her at that moment.
Yeah, that it kind of incarnates her in a way. Yeah, and I think when you're talking about Christ in particular, there's the historical figure, who's a real person with a body, right? And the ways in which, just, pulling it back from any kind of religious context, the ways in which we memorialize history with images or places. Abraham Heschel talks about this a lot, like memorializing time and space. I like to think about the fluidity of time, where many, many things can happen in one place. We see this with, for example, churches where like worship was going on in that place that preceded Christianity, let's say, that there was always a religious feeling to that place, right? And that by setting up these memorials in space, that we're actually memorializing the time. So I think, when we're talking about our current moment in which a lot of our, where our public art, that memorializes these people or these events, because sometimes they're not just statues, they're like memorials, where that is being actively torn down. It's usually not by the public petitioning their government to have it removed. It's usually by activists.
A mob.
Yeah. Okay. who is deciding that the story that the history and the story that we've all participated in until now is being transferred. is being changed. So do you want to give us your definition of iconoclasm as you understand it? I mean, obviously it has a historical context. There have been these moves of iconoclasm, right, from the earliest days of Christianity, really.
Yeah.
But then in these cycles, when there's a schism, or there will be this active destruction of images.
Yeah.
Right.
So there are two types of iconoclasm, let's say, in the Christian history. There's one type of iconoclasm, which is the removal of the foreign gods. And that's what we're seeing now. What we're seeing is the notion that there are people who say, I don't recognize these figures. I don't recognize them. They're not mine. They're someone else's. And all I see when I look at these figures are the negative aspect of what they are. And one of the reasons why I see the negative aspect is because I feel like I'm on the outside. I'm not on the inside. I'm not covered by the positive aspects of what these figures represent. And so that's what we're seeing. The other type of iconoclasm is a more ideological iconoclasm, which is removing our own images, right? And so the notion of removing even the image of Christ, though you say that Christ is God, that you worship Christ, but you still want to remove his image. And so maybe we can put that aspect of iconoclasm aside, because that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is a desire to remove what people recognize as being the foreign gods. We want to get rid of the principalities. We want to get rid of the origin. We want to destroy the story. We want to remove it. And that's what's happening. And Christians have done that. I always try to make sure that people remember that, especially as they react to seeing it happen. I'm not for what I'm seeing happen, but as we see it happen, we have to understand that Christians did that. When they convert a space, there tends to be a faction of the Christians who convert the space, who will go out and will now remove the ancient statues, remove the statues of the Greek, Roman gods, depending on where people have converted. One of the things Christians did was to take these statues of the gods, and make them decorations in gardens and stuff, but not have them in public places, not have them as let's say centers of veneration, centers of recognition. And so that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing people who want to destroy the story of America. That's what it is. And if people say that's not what's happening, they're really not paying attention.
Right.
And what happens is that when that happens, the ultimate purpose is to put up new statues. So it's not just about taking down the statues. The next move is to put up other statues. And putting up other statues means putting up another story, putting up and you see it in communist revolutions. That's why communist revolutions always have massive amounts of statues.
Right.
It's like, we're going to remove the churches, we're going to break the crosses, we're going to destroy the public things that attract people's attention and their unity, let's say, that are symbols of their unity. We need to break that down and then put up statues of Lenin everywhere.
Right.
And so that's what's coming, because it won't happen in just one way. There'll be other statues coming up if this continues on.
Yeah, I want to talk about what comes afterwards in a minute, but in the States, I mean, you're Canadian, so this is something that you're observing a little bit from the outside, although we're getting
similar things, just not as strong.
Right. And so it's happening in the UK, it's happening in the Netherlands, it's happening all over Europe. And sort of like the story of the West, right, is the one that needs to be transferred or amended. And but I learned a couple of weeks ago about the source of a lot of these Confederate statues, for example. They weren't, it wasn't like they were monuments that existed during the Confederacy. They were put up decades and decades later by a group, especially of women. I think it was the United Daughters of the Confederacy or something,
right,
who wanted to resurrect that story, that mythical story of the glorious Dixie past,
Yeah.
And
a kind of resistance, like we resisted the invader.
Right.
Yeah.
So even though we lost, we still are going to retain this myth, this story. And what that led to when they put up these statues in like the 1910s, 1920s, was that the children of that generation wound up being the really hardcore segregationists who were fighting the civil rights era, the civil rights movement, because they were so indoctrinated from such a young age. I mean, we saw that like in Nazi Germany too. You know, the real holdouts at the very end were those who had grown, you know, who had started as children and grown up during the 12 years of Nazism. They weren't the, you know, the old heads who remembered what it was like before.
Yeah.
So, so that'll be interesting to see where the children of this generation wind up coming up. Cause I don't pretend to have a crystal ball to know what comes next, but that will be interesting.
Yeah. But it is, like you said, it is possible too, that because these statues were put up as a last ditch effort to preserve a story, that story might be exhausted. And that's a reason why the statues are slowly coming down, you know?
Yeah, it's hard to defend
I don't know.
those.
It's possible. You have to do things very carefully. I mean, it depends what you want. The thing, like I said, the thing is that other statues are coming. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. Other statues are coming. And so it just depends on those that tear down the statues are the ones that are going to want to put up more statues, are going to want to put up the next statues. It's going to be the same people and with the same drive. And so people need to be attentive, because you're not necessarily going to want the statues they're going to be putting up either.
All right. So let's just scroll back a tiny little bit and talk about the types of statues that are being taken down, right? So the Confederate statues, I think for a number of reasons, that's fairly uncontroversial. It's kind of in the same vein as like, should state capitals still be flying the Confederate flag? No, you know, and we can have a debate about whether these statues go in some kind of museum or whatever. I think that's kind of immaterial in a sense. Or maybe that's for the South to wrestle with, you know, within that very distinct culture. I don't know.
Yeah. But you really have to, it's like you have to be able to integrate your dark part. You have to be able to integrate it, because if you don't, that's the difficulty, is that those things don't go away.
Right.
That stuff doesn't go away. You have to be able to integrate the dark aspects of your history somehow, or else they're going to come back and devour you. And so there needs to be work in the South to find a way to be able to preserve their story and to acknowledge the dark aspects of it, but not try to get rid of the dark aspects of their story. That's the crazy thing that I don't understand, or that I feel is so naive, that people think that you can just raise the table. They can just get rid of the story. And so it's like, let's just get rid of all the Confederate flags and then we'll be fine. But no, because that's the story. The story is that was the way that the South identified for a long time in opposition to the North. So if you get rid of it completely, then it's going to fester like a wound. Yeah. And then at some point, the only way for you to get out of that is to either accept a kind of humiliation where you have someone kind of pressing down on you, or you're like, okay, forget this. I'm going to fight back. And then you're going to have larger and larger groups of people that are ultimately going to get together and want to fight back the fact that they're being told to get out of the way. Right. And so it's a dangerous game that's being played, because those that have succeeded in healing the divides are those that have been able to integrate their past. And you see it like, and sometimes it looks weird. It doesn't look right, you know, but you can see that those that try to unify are those that try to integrate.
Yeah, I think that's what the Christian story does so well, is integrates this notion of sin, you know, both on the individual level and as nations. You know, there can be national sin that needs to be reckoned with, and we see that, you know, all throughout Scripture. And it seems to me that what we're seeing is this confusion over really what we're talking about is sin, except that's not the word that's being used.
Yeah.
You know, there are all sorts of other words that are being used for it, but it's a desire to inculcate a sense of shame over sin. Yeah. But it doesn't have, like you're saying, an integration where you can deal with it, but then also have a redemptive
Yeah, there's no redemptive arc in this story.
Right.
And I hope that it's being done in a kind of naive manner, because, I really hope that that's what's going on, but there's no redemptive arc. And so the only solution is scapegoating. That's the only solution, because if there's no
Yes.
redemptive arc, then you have to find the guilty one and get rid of them and purge them, right? That's the only way to get rid of this problem.
Right.
Or else you're not going to find a semblance of unity ever.
Right.
And it's a scary path to go down.
And we've seen it before, right? I mean, I've been reading a lot of Václav Havel from Czechoslovakia, and thinking about, dissident artists who, were forced underground at a certain point, and how they chose to walk out that disenfranchisement, that denial of participation in the society, because they refused to go along with that, and I think that's maybe a discussion for a whole other day, is like the position of the dissident artist in all of this. But I think,
well, now the funny thing, it's really important to understand what's happening and how strange it is that the dissident artist right now, the dissident artist has the dissident artist. So let's say the graffiti artist, that's the greatest way that's the best dissident artist, right? The graffiti artist has the support of every corporation in almost every level of government. So what is happening? There is a massive desire coming from the most powerful people in the world to break this system, or whatever it is, to break the story and to replace it with another one.
Mm-hmm.
And so who's the dissident artist now?
Right.
I always joke, it's like, I'm a way more dissident artist than anybody, in terms of the idea that, like, no, I'm not going to get into a gallery making icons. Like, I'm not going to have people write books about my work. It's not going to happen. There's no way that the level of attention that I'll ever be able to attract is always going to be minimal, because I'm actually making traditional art. And so the whole system is so upside down that everybody's fighting to be the most dissident so they can be the most famous.
Mm-hmm.
And so Banksy is a corporation. I'm sorry. Look, you can like Banksy as much as you want,
sure,
but he is a sly salesman.
Mm-hmm.
Like that whole thing about his piece of art that was ripped during.
Art.
You think that wasn't planned? Oh, come on, people. If you think that wasn't planned with Banksy, you guys are complete naive. You're very naive.
Right. That's the whole point of it. Yeah. Yeah. And
all right, sorry. Off on a tangent there.
No. And I think that, again, I would want to do a whole other hour, and I will at some point do a whole hour on dissident art in terms of our national icons, right? Like when you start talking about the founders, even back to Columbus, you and I think as lovers of the medieval, we understand that all of this came from, all the conquest and the, that age of conquest, that came from somewhere. It didn't just it wasn't the way it always was. And it didn't just spring, fully formed from Zeus's head or whatever, Yeah. So there's the teardown of those foundational, people who up until very recently, we all held in common that though there were certain realities about their lives that were not consistent like any one of us, right? The ideas were what were paramount, right? Yeah. The ideas of equality were something that the founders and the, early leaders were striving toward. They were holding themselves toward that, or they were at least slouching toward that standard. You know what I mean? So there's that. Okay. And then I want to also throw out there two other things and just get your reaction to these. So Sean King and his call to actively tear down, remove depictions of white Jesus or European Jesus. Now, I'm I grew up in a Jewish home. I'm very well aware that Jesus was a Judean man, from the Levant region of the Middle East, certainly not blue-eyed and blonde-haired. Okay.
Yeah. To think that you could know what exactly they look like in the first century is really ill-intentioned, I would say,
mm-hmm.
And so that's not how the image making happens. It's just not how it happens.
Right.
Look, this is a very disturbing battleground on which to engage, because you're not going to there's no positive thing at the end of this.
Mm-hmm.
There just isn't.
It's just destruction. Mm-hmm.
It's just going to be destruction, because the notion that that would be the prime question of how you represent Christ is a very dangerous one.
I was going to say, I think that, you know, a huge bank of academics who study medieval history and art, and every art student on the planet would probably take issue with, or should take issue with this absolutely ignorant understanding of the depiction of Jesus, the depiction of the saints, the history behind it, even the notion of how race was understood.
Yeah. All of this was not at all the same.
Yeah, pre 1600, the notion of race was not even. It's not modern.
The
you know, this
thing
is
to
modern
understand
thing.
for the West, especially, is that Jesus was always not us. Let's say in terms of ethnic group or in terms of cultural group. Jesus was also not us. Like, Jesus was Jewish, and we're not Jewish. Like, our culture, we're Westerners, we're Northerners, we're Greek, we're Roman, we're, you know, let's say 90% of Christians don't have a Jewish background. You know,
Sure.
they're something else. And so the notion is that for most people, Jesus is not us. And so that's already important. So no matter how you represent him, whether you represent him, you'll tend to represent Jesus in a manner that's more isolated, where everybody's isolated from each other in terms of space and in terms of capacity to communicate. You're going to end up representing Jesus with tropes which resemble your people. And it's not going to happen consciously. It's going to happen very, you make a face. Well, the faces you see are the faces that are going to inform the way you represent Jesus. Mm-hmm. But the tradition about Christ is simple. He has long hair, he has a beard, and that's about it. Right. That's about it. Then it's very variable, and it'll change. The idea, even like, it's weird because the idea that somehow the blue-eyed Jesus is like a standard of Christianity is just not true.
Ridiculous.
It's just completely ridiculous.
Yeah. And by that same logic, you would have to then also destroy, I have in my home, in my living room, these beautiful posters from India of Jesus depicted as, an Indian guru. So by that logic, I would have to destroy those too, because Jesus wasn't from India.
Yeah. But one of the difficulties is it's just the question, the fact that we've entered the question into the representation. There's no solution. Once you start to think in those terms, once you start to make that the main question, there's no solution. And I'll give you a story, because this is something that an iconographer that I care about and I love very much, he was struggling with this. Right. He was struggling with this because he was painting a church, and he wanted to represent a diverse church, and he wanted to be ethnically diverse. And so then he was like, so he represented, so he made these pictures, and then in the saints, he also represented a Chinese saint, and he represented St. Moses the Black, who was a black man, and he tried to find like a native saint and whatever. Then so he made this, and he thought he was solving the solution, and then immediately, right away, people started saying that he was tokenizing these characters.
Right.
And they were right. And I asked him, I said, are there people in your church that have a particular veneration, that have a particular affection for these saints? And he said, no. Mm-hmm. So the reason why I put them there was because he wanted to be diverse. Mm-hmm. And I said, you're asking the wrong questions. Mm. The relationship to the saints are relationships of affection and feeling like you're connected to that saint. And so if there are people in your parish that feel connected to these or that saints, and they ask for those saints to be represented, then you represent them for that reason. But once you get on the path of wanting to think about race and ethnic questions and everything, then whichever direction you go, you're going to lose. You're going to lose that fight, And I made icons of St. Moses the Black, and I made icons of native saints, and I made icons of saints of different ethnic backgrounds. But it was because I was making them for a church that was dedicated to that saint, making it for a community that had a special veneration to that saint, not just because I wanted to prove to the world that I was making, ethnically diverse saints. To me, that's not a value in itself.
Yeah.
The saint has value because of the fact that that saint was a testimony and a shining light of God in the world, not because he was a member of this or that community. That's what matters.
Right. And I think Gosh, I mean, there's so much you could say about that in terms of the Christian ideal of friendship, right? Which right now we're, with the diversity initiatives, we're talking so much about allyship. I think we talked about this in our last conversation, that, an ally is somebody who you can still be far from, and you can notice them from afar, and they'll have certain characteristics that you notice.
Mm.
But a friend is somebody who, comes close, right? So what you're talking about is, instead of the kind of allyship of creating these images that token, the friendship of saying, this particular saint is part of our friendship. It's, we have friendship with this saint, we have a relationship, and it's built out of that. So in terms of current events, we see that people have absolutely heeded Sean King's call, and we're seeing now this rash of arson, churches being destroyed, which is not making the news, because it's not the right story, right? So the fact that somebody would act on a distinct call, which I would say it was incitement, from Sean King, the fact that people are acting on that because it fits in this story, it's not being heeded, right?
Because the reason, all of what's behind this is revolution. That's what's behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's about the whole idea of breaking down the narrative, and destroying Christianity is an inevitable aspect of that. It was during the Communist Revolution. It was during the French Revolution. You have to destroy the existing narrative if you want to replace it with something else. It's inevitable that they'll, especially as Christianity wanes and there are less people to hold up. It's like, if Nantes Cathedral burns, what's going to happen? Nothing's going to happen. It's easy. It's an easy target. It works in terms of destroying the narrative. And so it's going to happen. I think it's inevitable. We're going to see it happen more and more, destroying the existing story in order to replace it with another one.
Mm-hmm.
And these gestures, especially if there's no reaction to them, they are very powerful in giving a sign of what story is winning, what story is on top. For their story to work, the attacks need to happen from the power to the powerless. So because the Christians are understood as the ones having the power and owning the story, then if you burn down churches, it's not as big of a problem. You're punching up. Wait. You're punching up, I guess. Yeah. That's how they see it. Right. Although very, very soon and very rapidly, it's not going to be the case. Yeah. I would say, like, for example, here in Quebec, if you would have people, attacking churches, it wouldn't be punching up, because those churches are all empty and no one cares. And they become architectural monuments. And so, but what could be interesting, not interesting in a good way, but let's say inevitable, is that at some point you pretend like you're punching up, but you're actually punching down, which is what the Nazis did. Yeah. The Nazis didn't think they were persecuting a small minority of beleaguered people. They thought they were dismantling power itself, a powerful secret group that were basically ruling the world secretly. And so they thought they were punching up. But they, obviously they weren't, but that's what they thought they were doing. And so I see that is something that could easily happen here quite rapidly, where people think that by burning down churches or continuing to attack or dismantle Christian institutions, that they're somehow still, fighting power, but in fact they're not. They're scapegoating. Right. Yeah, I think it bears mentioning here too that people don't think about the fact that, white evangelical American Christianity is not the norm. The vast majority of Christians around the world are people of color. That's for sure. And so to attack Christianity, and even in America, Christianity is like very firmly important, in Black communities. Oh yeah. Oh my goodness. So it's such a naive, and really it's a deep ignorance that would say that by attacking Christianity itself, or by attacking, white Jesus or whatever, that we're punching against white supremacy. It's ridiculous. Yeah. there are sins. Like, this is the thing that I talk about all the time, and it's a thing with Washington and the let's say the founders of the United States, or Columbus, all these people, is that there are sins there.
Yes.
And so it's not like Christianity wasn't used to advance supremacist goals, or wasn't used to colonize, or
Right.
to crush other cultures. Of course it was. Like, we're not naive here. This definitely happened. Now, this is what I mean when I talk about integrating the dark parts. My contention is that I want all that dark stuff in my backpack. I want to say, that's mine. Like, I have it. I don't want to take it off. And I also I need to integrate it in a way that is healthy. And self-flagellation is not the healthy way to integrate it, right? You have to be able to confess your sins and to recognize your sins, but you also need to be able to integrate and then move forward in order to do something better. Because if you just self-flagellate and you accept to be a kind of scapegoat in the situation, maybe that can work too. Some saints have done it, and but the way I'm seeing things going right now, I don't see it ending up in a positive manner.
Right. I mean, I think of when you put a seed in the ground, you're putting that seed into darkness. It grows up out of darkness, and it bears fruit. That's how you integrate something. You allow it to be part of that process, and to have something grow out of it, and that's what forgiveness does. True forgiveness is not forgetting, or erasing one's own sins, or the sins of their fathers, or the sins of their nation. True forgiveness is that integration of acknowledging, yes, these things were wrong. Yes, there are ways I may have even participated in that, to the extent that I'm conscious of it.
One of the things that is causing this problem, it seems, is that because of American supremacy, because of the fact that Americans rule the world, basically. Culturally and story-wise, and in terms of power. Because of that, it seems like in this case, their total ignorance of other cultures is really working against them. Because once you start to travel and you start to understand other cultures and start to understand how other people exist, you realize that these patterns are there. They're everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. They're everywhere. It's the idea that there are marginalized communities is in every culture.
Yes.
The idea that there are some people who have been excluded is in every culture. I lived in Congo for 7 years, and the entire social structure was a very, very tightly caste system of different tribes that at first you don't realize, because you don't have the markers to recognize the different tribes where they are. But then you realize, wait a minute, it's always this tribe that are in positions of authority. It's always this tribe that are doing the manual labor. It's always, and so you realize that the whole society is segregated in a caste system. And I'm not saying, I'm just saying that that's just how it's just there everywhere.
Right. So right now, I think maybe you would agree that the story of American, individualism, let's say, which might be born even out of a Judeo-Christian idea of, an individual with his or her own choices and sins and need for redemption and all of those things, right? The individual's ability to have true agency in the world, right? So that is now being the narrative that's replacing that is one of collectivism.
Yeah.
Right. And we've definitely seen that narrative play out before, the collectivist narrative, whether it's through communism or Nazism or what have you. I want to think specifically about the artist, because I worked for a long time in advertising. Not a long time, actually. I worked for long enough in advertising to know that I was not meant to be there. When you work in advertising or the commercial arts, where you're part of an agency, it's not like you get to sign your name to the Cheerios illustration. You're part of a collective. You're part of a corporation who's putting a visual out there. I found that in those environments, for myself as an artist, I couldn't exist there because either the corporation wasn't something that I wanted to work for, or this sense of that all the artists in the room needed to work exactly the same, and it needed to be okay with somebody hovering over their shoulder, or, you know, these like endless meetings where nothing got accomplished, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because where if you would just let the artist go, they could have had the solution within 20 minutes, you know. So I'm specifically thinking in this moment where we have this tear down of art, you know, this whole narrative really, it's centering around art, which is so
Mm-hmm.
interesting to me,
Yeah.
whether it's these statues or whether it's literature and
Yeah.
banned
Movies,
books,
all of it. Yeah.
movies, cancellation of actors, let's say, who aren't
Mm-hmm.
allowed to play certain roles or whatever. So it's this cancellation of the individual and the individual work of art with respect to the narrative. The narrative is king, right?
Mm.
Sort of like the corporation. What kind of exhortation would you give right now to artists who are feeling this pressure to like to be very public, whether it's on Instagram or, you know, whatever? I mean, my podcast really is about getting back to that artistic process and understanding yourself as an artist, as an individual artist with a process, and that not all of that needs to see the light of day, right? So that individual hidden work, and then the artwork that we create from that space. Like, is there something that you would like to say for how artists can kind of navigate this weird time of art making?
Yeah. Well, I would say the first thing I might do is maybe like maybe I want to push you a little bit in
Okay,
terms of the first statement you made in
please do.
terms of individualism and collectivism. I think that both of those are a lie. I
Okay,
think that both individualism and collectivism is a lie. The reality is communion. That's the reality. The
yes, okay,
reality is the breathing in and breathing out between individuals and community. And
fair.
so there is a give and take that happens between your own experience and your need to be in relationship with others and to be in communion with others. And so the difficulty that you have, and that difficulty is expressed exactly the same difficulty you have in terms of individualism and collectivism, is expressed in your problem about the advertising agency and the individual artist, which is that both of those are also pushed in their extreme. They're also a lie to a certain extent, because the notion of, like you said, making advertisement that is completely purpose driven, right? That the only reason for its existence is to sell a product or to sell something, to get people to act in a certain direction. Like that's the only reason why it exists. And so it's fully instrumentalized, right? And then you have this idea of the free artist who's just making things, for beauty and for just ideals, like serving ideals or whatever. And so the reality is that we need to bridge those two extremes into what I call communion. And so getting to the question of my exhortation is, I think that solving that problem is going to be the way to get out of this morass, because we need people who are able to tell the story and to make the images, to make the right images. And the images that need to be made and the story that needs to be told is that story, is the story of the union of the extremes, is the story of how the individual and the collective are joined, is the story of how the artist can both serve a higher purpose without being fully an instrument of that purpose, like without making propaganda,
Right.
because propaganda is one dimensional. And so there has to be that breathing in and breathing out. And so one of the things, like, I can only speak out of my own strategy, let's say, or the thing that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take the Christian story, to take the narrative of Christianity, to take the deep well that has been handed to me from my ancestors, in the sense of the people that have come before me in the church. And now I'm trying to reformulate that at every level that I can. And that means that I am creating icons, which are sacred images in the church, in the liturgical space, that people venerate, that they use in their prayer life and everything. And so that's, you could say, the highest. And in a way, that's the place where I disappear the most, right? Where I try to kind of vanish the most and really kind of enter into something a purpose which transcends me, right? But I'm also making a comic book about stories of a dog-headed saint, and an adventure story. And I'm also making t-shirts, and I'm making all these different other things, which are closer to my capacity as an individual artist to reframe things and to experiment and to push them further. But I'm just trying to understand the function of all these different aspects of the creative process and how we need to integrate them. They need to have a flow between them so that we can recapture culture. Because right now, popular entertainment, pretty much most popular entertainment has taken up a revolutionary stance, even though it's not really, but at least in terms of narrative.
It is more corporate.
It's taken up like a kind of weird revolutionary idea. But then we don't, and then we have, let's say, something like making statues, like making statues that are there to celebrate our connection to the nation, but it's all broken in between. Like everything is broken. So that's what I think artists should do. And the way to do it is to re-explore the ancient stories, to know our stories, to know the patterns, so that we can reformulate them in ways that are connected to the world today, and not just pastiche, and not just a kind of faded memory of a long past, because that doesn't help either. Nostalgia is deadly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Nazis definitely trafficked in nostalgia quite a bit.
Yeah, we don't. I always say tradition without nostalgia, right? The idea of connecting yourself to that which makes you, but then doing it with forward looking and moving into the world and connecting to the realities and the questions that the world has today.
Mm-hmm. So communion and integration, reconnecting back into these ancient stories. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm trying to do the same thing. We're in the same paradigm, I would say.
Great.
Jonathan, thanks so much for coming on board today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I wish you all the best with your podcast as well.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Vesper.
All right. Take care. Bye. Thanks for joining me for this week's Vesperisms. Well, have you ordered your copy of A Cloud of Outrageous Blue yet? It's almost here. And I've got a lot of fun book events coming up, and they're mostly online, and these are not going to be your average author talking head Zoom calls. I've got giveaways and challenges and calls for fan art coming up, so you are going to want to follow me on Instagram at Vesperism and subscribe to my monthly newsletter at vesperism.com. And when you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll not only get my latest news, but you'll also get a free outtake chapter from A Cloud of Outrageous Blue. And I would love if you'd leave a 5-star review for the podcast. That'll help others find Vesperisms, because we need to spread the message of an artistic worldview to more people, don't you think? Music for Vesperisms is provided, as always, by Ben and Vesper, and that's my band. At such a time as this, fellow artist, your voice is important and your contribution matters. Just remember, work isn't everything, but everything is the work. See you next time.